Welcome, everyone, to this webinar about the Presbyterian Church in Canada's decisions regarding LGBTQI2 plus inclusion. My name is Kara Earhart, and I'm responsible for program work at the PCC's national office related to gender, sexuality, and LGBTQI2 plus inclusion. As we begin this webinar, which touches on topics related to sexuality, gender identity, and gender expression, it's important for us to recognize the lands that we're on and how our relationships with these lands impact our relationships with one another. As a non-Indigenous person living and working on the land that we currently call Toronto, Canada, I recognize that this land has been home and a place of significance for many Indigenous peoples, such as the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Anishinaabe, including most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. And meanwhile, there are people joining this webinar from coast to coast. So from Mi'kmaq in the east to the Esquimalt and Songhees territories in the west, we have a long way to go to ensure that Indigenous peoples' rights are fulfilled, that their needs are met, and that communities can heal from the violence of colonialism and the residential school system. Some of this healing work overlaps with our topics today, and Indigenous people, particularly Two-Spirit folks, are working to reclaim their traditional teachings about gender, sexuality, and family structures. Teachings that have been stifled through government and church coordinated efforts to remove Indigenous people, particularly children, from their home nations as a means of limiting Indigenous access to land and wealth. As a church, we acknowledge the damage our institution has caused Indigenous peoples. In all that we do, including all the learning we'll do today and the conversations we'll have, may we work to repair our wrongdoings and intentionally make different choices in the future. Our time today is going to consist of a short presentation about the denomination's decisions regarding marriage, ordination, and ministry with LGBTQI2 plus people, followed by about 40 minutes for questions and answers, give or take. The decisions we'll be speaking about today touch on many areas of our work here at National Office. So there are 5 of us here available on this call to share information and answer questions based on our respective responsibilities. Victor Kim and Don Muir, the clerks of assembly, are here to answer questions that pertain to the work of the General Assembly office. And then from the Life and Mission Agency, we are joined by Ian Ross McDonald, the General Secretary for the Life and Mission Agency, and Tim Purvis, the Associate Secretary for Ministry and Church Vocations. Before Don tells us about the denomination's decisions about marriage and ordination, Ian's going to walk us through just a few notes to keep in mind throughout the presentation.
We understand that God creates all people in God's image, and people of all sexual orientations and gender identities are equally loved by God. In every context, we assume that people who are LGBTQI+, their families, their loved ones, and those who love them are part of all church gatherings. So in all our meetings, writing, and speaking in the church, we use language that demonstrates care and that respects the dignity and worth of others, even when we do not agree. While there is no live participation in this presentation, these are good best practices for all of us to use and recall at all meetings. In the next slide, we will review the ways that people can engage in this presentation. During the presentation, you can submit questions anytime that they occur to you. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you open the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can submit questions anytime. And if you're not able to see the Q&A button, you can open the More button with 3 dots above it at the bottom of your screen to find the Q&A section. The questions will be answered for the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. And please remember to submit your questions in the form that is a question. Keep your questions general. Questions will be kept anonymous as this webinar is being recorded. And if you would like your question answered by somebody in particular, please specify the name of the person you would like to answer the question.
Okay. My name's Don Muir, Deputy Clerk in the General Assembly. In 2019, the General Assembly forwarded these 2 remits that you see on this slide They forwarded them to the presbyteries of our denomination so that they could approve or disapprove them. And this is just a routine step of the Barrier Act process. In 2020, the General Assembly was canceled due to COVID concerns, so no action was taken until 2021. During the 2021 General Assembly, the Committee on Remits reported that a majority of the presbyteries approved both remits. That approval meant that the Committee on Remits could recommend that the remits be voted on by the 2021 General Assembly. Both remits were adopted and became the law of the Church. Consequently, the Presbyterian Church in Canada's position on marriage now includes two equal and parallel definitions of marriage, as described in the remit, and the PCC's position on ordination means LGBTQI persons, whether married or single, are eligible to be ordained as ministers of word and sacraments or as ruling elders. Since sessions are responsible for the use of church buildings, subject to the oversight of presbyteries, the session decides whether same-sex weddings can be conducted on church premises. Ministers are also free to decide if they will conduct same-sex weddings. If a session and minister have a different opinion regarding which definition of marriage they accept, it's hoped that they will reach a reasonable and respectful understanding or compromise as they serve the church together. For example, if the session welcomes same-sex weddings and the minister does not, they might agree to invite a guest minister to conduct same-sex weddings at the church. If the minister accepts same-sex weddings but the session does not, the minister might arrange to conduct the ceremony in another location. Where a same-sex wedding cannot take place at the church, the policy of the PCC is that whenever possible, that the couple be referred to a minister or congregation where the wedding can take place. The decision regarding since sessions are, I said that already, sorry. The decision regarding ordination includes liberty of conscience and action. That means ministers and elders are allowed to not participate in a service of ordination or induction of ministers, and a service of ordination admission to the session of elders. Nevertheless, the ordination of all elders and ministers is to be recognized and respected as full members of the courts of the church. Of course, the church still requires a discernment process to determine if candidates for ministry or elder candidates have gifts and abilities for this kind of ministry. Nevertheless, during discernment, it's not appropriate to ask a candidate for ministry or eldership about their sexuality or marital status when discerning their call. The focus, as always, should be on whether the candidate has the faith and other gifts to provide pastoral care and leadership in the church. Individuals are free to express openly which of the two definitions of marriage they accept, as long as their acceptance does not exclude the right of others to hold a different position. No one should be harassed or judged by someone with an alternative view. Instead, everyone should be respected and valued as we strive to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace as we share in ministry together in Christ.
Thanks, Don, for that overview. I'll be talking a little bit more now about the PCC's decisions about ministry with LGBTQI2 plus people more broadly, and particularly in the context of homophobia and transphobia. Again, these are just overviews, so there's lots of time for you to ask your questions following the presentation. As far back as 1985, the General Assembly reports have recognized that homophobia, and that is a fear and or hatred of gay people, was a form of hatred that the church ought to oppose as vigorously as any other. So name-calling, bullying, exclusion, prejudice, or discrimination or acts of violence towards anyone because of their real or assumed sexual orientation should not be tolerated any more than other types of hatred within the church. In 2017, the Committee on Church Doctrine and the Life and Mission Agency presented a joint report to General Assembly acknowledging the denomination had not acted sufficiently to repent of homophobia and hypocrisy, since the call to do so was issued in 1994. This inaction had contributed to a culture of silence where LGBTQI2+ people and our loved ones felt afraid of naming the ways that the church was failing to meet our needs or was actively harming us. And so the 2017 Assembly initiated a process for LGBTQI2+ people and others to share their stories of harm related to homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism, and hypocrisy, as well as grace received in the denomination. Stories that directly led to the church adopting a public confession in 2022, which commits the whole church to working to repair the harm we have caused due to homophobia and transphobia, and to prevent further harm. The special committee responsible for hearing and stewarding those stories, known as Rainbow Communion, presented its final report in 2021 with 23 recommendations to guide the church forward in a good way, all of which were adopted. Two of these decisions we're going to look at a little more closely right now. One which said that courts of the church, agencies, colleges, and camps should review and update their policies, practices, and procedures to reflect the full inclusion of all people. The church also recognized the need for guidelines to help church courts and committees to become safer spaces for all. Now, as we think about those two decisions, it's helpful for us to have some shared understanding of what we mean by inclusion, since I think people hold very different ideas of what that word means. The following definition, which is partly on your screen, is by Lily Zhang, and it's one that I find really useful in our context. They say that inclusion is the achievement of an environment that all stakeholders, especially underserved and marginalized populations, trust to be respectful and accountable. And inclusion is achieved through actions that explicitly counter present-day and historical inequities and meet the unique needs of all populations. The following, and these are on your screen as well, are some areas for us to tend to as we review our policies, practices, and procedures. In terms of pastoral care, while many of the principles of good pastoral care are broadly applicable, regardless of someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, leaders in the church may wish to pursue some continuing education about LGBTQI2+ specific care, simply because there's other lenses or contexts that can be helpful in making sure that we're meeting the needs of the folks in our communities. Faith formation and education, again, while not entirely specific to LGBTQI2+ people's needs, it can be really helpful to consider the impact of faith formation or Christian education programs that you offer in your ministry. And asking questions like, how well are these programs equipping our congregants or members or participants to engage well in conversations about challenging topics as they relate to our faith? As Dawn talked about earlier, being able to engage respectfully and well, regardless of which of the two definitions of marriage one affirms, can be really important, of course, in the life of the church, and it is something that we expect. In worship, making shifts towards using gender-inclusive language can reduce barriers that many LGBTQI2+ people encounter, especially non-binary and gender non-conforming people, to feeling meaningfully connected to their worship experience. Our confession acknowledges that sometimes our worship can be very alienating to people who don't identify as straight or cisgender, which means that they don't identify with their birth-assigned sex. Likewise, using gender-expansive language for God, a practice that the PCC has encouraged since the late 1980s, can open up possibilities for people to feel more connected with the divine, again, regardless of their gender or their sexual orientation. Dawn has already outlined some of the considerations related to hiring practices and communication about things like wedding policies. So I'm going to leave those there for now so we can have more time for questions. Again, these are just some examples of common features of ministry life where review and updates maybe will improve your ability to achieve the kind of inclusion or inclusive environment that Lily describes. And you may well think of more and think of ways that these can be applied in other contexts of your ministry in relation with other identities. For now, though, we're going to move on to questions and answers. So Ian, can you remind us of what this next 40 minutes or so is going to look like?
Sure. First, I just remind people that everybody will receive a copy of this recording when the presentation is over. This is a time to pose your questions, and you can do that by putting questions in the question and answer section of Zoom. You can open the question and answer button by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. It has two bubbles above it, and if you can't find it, you can open the More button and find the Q&A button there. Very happy to take questions on anything, and we have received a few questions already. A reminder that if you want somebody specific to answer the question, you can put that directly in your question, and we'll make sure that it's posed to the person that you are asking to answer it. One of the questions, Kara, that people sometimes ask is, what do I have liberty of conscience to decide to do or not to do in regard to the church's decisions? And I don't know whether the clerks or might answer that question. So which of the church's decisions are we able to exercise conscience on?
Sure, Ian, it's Victor. So I can take a crack at that question. So liberty of conscience really refers to the two remits that were adopted coming out of the 2019 General Assembly. And the first remit is remit B regarding marriage, and the second remit is remit C regarding the ordination of LGBTQI persons. So those are the two remits where people can exercise their liberty of conscience. And if I just go to the remits specifically, can I just pull this up here? There we go. Yeah. So for remit B, that the Presbyterian Church in Canada holds two parallel definitions of marriage and recognizes that faithful, Holy Spirit-filled, Christ-centered, God-honoring people can understand marriage as a covenant relationship between a man and a woman, or as a covenant relationship between two adult persons. And the liberty of conscience and action is that congregations, sessions, ruling and teaching elders be granted liberty of conscience and action on marriage. And I think Don went through this a little bit in his presentation, that sessions, congregations, ruling and teaching elders have the ability to either choose to hold one of the definitions or the other. What we don't want is that in choosing one of the definitions, that you prevent others from holding the other definition. So the liberty of conscience and action gives a minister or a session, a congregation, the ability to say, this is where we find ourselves, but not to the exclusion of others being able to find themselves in a different place. It's just that gives you the freedom to say, we will or I will not perform for example, a same-sex wedding. But it doesn't mean that others are not allowed to. And of course, Don has touched upon the fact that even exercising liberty of conscience and action, we do want those ministers and those congregations to be able to offer alternatives for people who are seeking to be married in a particular congregation or by a particular minister. When it comes to ordination, liberty of conscience and action regards the call and ordination of ministers and the election or ordination of ruling elders who happen to be LGBTQI persons, married or single. And so as we have understood this, when it comes to exercising liberty of action and conscience around ordination, the clerk's guideline, the guidelines that the clerks have offered have said that a person, a member of a church court, can exercise liberty of conscience and action regarding a potential call, ordination, or induction of an LGBTQI person by either abstaining from voting for the ordination, induction, or installation, or voting against the ordination, induction, or installation, or sending regrets to any meeting dealing with the ordination, induction, or installation of an individual. Again, none of that negates the fact that that ordination, induction, and installation has authority and effect and is effective throughout the church. It's just that an individual who wishes to exercise their liberty of conscience and action can either abstain from voting for it or vote negatively or send regrets to the actual installation, ordination, or induction service. Again, it does not negate the efficacy of such an ordination or an induction or an installation. It's just that it allows the particular individual to say, I will not be there, or I will not vote in favor, or I will not vote.
Thank you, Victor. Kara, there's a question for you. How can sessions or other courts make decisions about respectful practices when they are divided in their beliefs about sexual orientation and gender identity? So this is a question about respectful practices in debate and decision-making in sessions and presbyteries in the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can answer that. And I'll add a little bit too to what Victor was saying about which decisions people have liberty of conscience around and which ones apply more broadly or have a different type of application. So Victor just explained there's very specific and clear instances where liberty of conscience and action applies and to specific roles in the church. Whereas when we look at the decisions from Rainbow Communion, when we look at the confession, when we look at statements from prior to 2021 about dealing with homophobia and transphobia, these really involve effort from everyone in the church, from people in the pews to staff members to ministers, elders. So part of how I certainly think about this work is that we do not do any service to the church as a whole, and certainly not specifically to LGBTQI2 plus people and our loved ones, if we are not able to have disagreements about these topics in ways that are full of grace and compassion and care for one another. So earlier in this presentation, we had a couple of guidelines up on the screen about how we would have those conversations. Again, even though in this setting, there's not a back and forth conversation in the same way. So I talk with congregations, especially sessions, about setting up processes in ways that center the needs of LGBTQI2 plus people first. And that's not to the exclusion of other people involved in those conversations, but to say, we won't have conversations about LGBTQI2 plus people as if they aren't in the room or as if there aren't people in this room who are their family members, their loved ones. We recognize that there are people in the church already who are full and faithful members that happen to be LGBTQI2 plus people. Some of how you can engage in these conversations, if it's just for within session, I think making sure that you have clear expectations about what you're talking about and what you're not talking about. So, you might start by saying, we want to eventually talk about our wedding policy. Before we do that, we have a few other matters we want to tend to. That's some of how I would start by setting up those respectful conversations. And then if you're talking about the congregation more broadly, again, you want to have really, really clear channels for communication and clear opportunities for people to talk about what they think, both positive and negative. And you might do that in a one-on-one context first, where people can speak with a certain group of elders who are well prepared for those conversations. Giving people a chance to share what they think, and also for you to correct some misconceptions about the church's decisions and policies, often gives people the confidence that they're going to be respected. And again, going back to that definition of inclusion, we're talking about respect and accountability. People want to know that the communities they've been part of for a long time are still listening to them, that there's still a place for them, and that they will be respected in that setting. Ian, do you feel like that answers that question?
I think it could. I think that the conversations that sessions and courts have around issues that are difficult could be guided by some of the advice that was written in the resources that were made available as well soon after the General Assembly made its decisions, that are available on the sexuality webpage. There are some other questions about vacancies now. People are wondering what you can ask a candidate about their position when you're interviewing a minister during a vacancy as you seek to fill the pulpit. Is it appropriate to ask them questions about the position they hold? And what other questions are permissible and not permissible? Perhaps the clerks would take that question.
I think the answer is that congregations, for example, can be clear about what their session has decided on their stance around either marriage or ordination. Again, as stated earlier on, you can't ask certain questions of candidates, which are just part of the human rights legislation. But I think a candidate is free to be able to speak about where they might be on the position of either the same-sex marriage or the ordination of LGBTQI individuals. And so they're free to volunteer that. But I think the question to ask is, given what the church has accepted through these remits, is the candidate prepared to be able to function within that context of what our remits have indicated? So I think that's a fair question. That opens up possibilities of sharing more at the discretion of the candidate. Again, I think the congregation and their profile can state where they may be, which can give a good indication to a prospective candidate whether they might be a good fit for that ministry or not. So I think that would be one of the things. So I don't think you can ask about an individual's particular individual orientation or practice, but you can certainly ask whether they would be willing to accept or whether they do accept, which really you have to, the church's stance through the remits that were adopted. So I think that's what you can ask. And again, an individual candidate is free to volunteer what positions that they may hold. I don't know, Don, if you want to add any more to that.
I think it might be important just to add that a question might be, how would you manage if you are having a conversation with session or with individuals within the church who have a different position than you on these subjects? How would you handle that?
Thank you. We have a question about, are there best practices or activities that have been outlined for presbyteries to take if they want to advance or promote inclusion within their bounds? I wonder, Kara, would you start to answer that question, and perhaps others would chime in afterwards?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of presbyteries specifically, less so. There are more specific guidelines and pieces of guidance for congregations and, again, camps, colleges, in a resource that was produced in 2022. And we'll have information about where to find those resources at the end of this presentation. But in terms of presbyteries, I think presbyteries that are keen to care for the congregations in their bounds in this way, might come up with some process or an opportunity for check-ins with the congregations to see, have you been updating your wedding policies? Have you been having these conversations? Is there more support that you need? I think that would be a reasonable step for presbyteries. From time to time, we've had questions or heard about presbyteries that may wish to declare themselves either as affirming or not affirming one of the two definitions that the denomination accepts about marriage. That isn't really a particularly useful measure to take within our own governance structures, because presbyteries are accountable to the General Assembly decisions. So if a presbytery said, we won't allow anyone in this presbytery to operate under X definition of marriage, that would be inappropriate and difficult to apply. Yeah, is there anything that the clerks would want to add to that, or Ian, anything that you would want to add in about what presbyteries could or could not be doing or should be doing?
I would think it would help presbyteries to have clear and open and healthy conversations about how they'll deal with any disagreements that might arise when it comes to dealing with calls and certifying students, and being clear about what the limits of conscience are so that there is no confusion, and that people aren't debating the limits of conscience when they should be doing the discernment work of the church within the boundaries that the church has laid out. Yeah.
And I would add to that, Ian, that if there are presbyteries that are wondering how to do that well, or that would need support in doing that well, any of us who are presenting on this call would be happy to receive an invitation to give a presentation or a separate workshop for a presbytery. So absolutely contact us for anything like that.
There's a question about worship resources that I think perhaps I can answer. The question is, are there worship resources available on the PCC website that are inclusive from an LGBTQI2+ perspective? After the decisions were made by the General Assembly about marriage and about ordination, and after the recommendations from the Rainbow Communion were adopted, we went through the worship resources of the church and amended them in such a way that we made them not gender specific. So for instance, in the baptism service, we changed the word to child rather than son or daughter. And then people who are doing the baptism can choose how they would speak during those services and refer to the people being baptized. Same with marriage. We took out groom and bride and simply left it as name 1 and name 2. And the people performing the marriage can use the pronouns and the titles that are appropriate after their conversation with the people who are being married. We've also produced a record book for baptisms and weddings that are not gender specific, and that can be ordered through the church office. And we're in the midst of putting together a naming service for people who are trans and who were baptized with one name and have changed their name to something different than what they were baptized with. And generally, all the worship materials on the website are non-gender specific. Occasionally, we might find something that's quite old, and we try to change those as quickly as we find them. And if people find resources on the website that have gender specific language or are exclusive in some way, we'd love to know where those are on the website, and we'll amend them appropriately when we hear about them. We've had a pastoral question. Someone asks, or someone says, we have lost some valued members of our congregation due to their lack of knowledge about what the new policies actually mean and how they will be put into effect in the congregation. So the question is, how do we address this misinformation and people's misunderstanding about the implications of the decisions that the church has made? Maybe Kara and then the clerks, if they have something to add, could respond to that question about how do you deal with misinformation?
Yeah, I think misinformation is tricky, right? And in the church, it's very important that we're educating members of our congregation about the church's policies and about the congregation's policies specifically. I think for people who've already left, it in part depends on whether those folks are open to hearing from people in the congregation again. I wouldn't chase down people who very clearly don't want to hear from anyone. But I think that having some opportunities again to say, hey, I know that you've been away for a while. I'd love to sit down and listen to what you have to say. Might open some doorways to have more information about what those misunderstandings are so that you can answer those questions effectively. You know, I wouldn't necessarily like cold email someone the recording from this, but sessions may want to take a look at this recording when it's available, to see if this matches what their previous understanding was, and if not, again, how do you clarify some of those misunderstandings and misconceptions? But yeah, first and foremost, I think a spirit of grace, a spirit of openness. It's always appropriate when someone has left to say, we're sorry to have seen you go, recognize the position they had in the congregation previously, their role in the community. And also some people may say, yeah, no, I understand the decisions, and I still feel like I need to leave. And the best we could do is say, I'm sorry to hear that, and I wish you well. Maybe I can help you find a worshiping community that better meets your needs. I see, Victor, that you're unmuted. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks, Kara. I think that a lot of the issues stem from either a lack of information or a misunderstanding of information. And it's been my experience that either through an open session that would be led by the session, led by the elders and the minister for the congregation, where a lot of these questions, a lot of the issues could be addressed publicly, rather than being allowed to sort of be guessed at or arrived at privately without the context of others being able to speak into that conversation, including having resource people from the church, from the wider church, attend some of those sessions. When I was in pastoral ministry just before my position here, in both congregations that I was part of, we had a session-led series of meetings where people were invited to come and ask questions. At one point, it was prior to the remits being adopted, but when the church was in discernment about those questions. And then at my next congregation, it was actually after the remits had been introduced and were being discussed across the church. So, and then I was invited to actually be part of a round table at a different congregation, which I was not the minister at. And again, that was a fairly open discussion with a number of people. And we were able to, I think, dispel some concerns, some misunderstandings, which left people feeling a lot more informed and more comfortable about their knowledge around what decisions that the church had made and how it would impact them and how it would impact their congregation. Now, it may come to the point that even after all of that, people may still feel a certain way about the decisions that the denomination has made, and when we'll choose to go elsewhere. And again, then I would echo what you said, that we just need to take a very, very pastoral approach and offer all the assistance and all the help that we can, hoping that they might find a church home elsewhere. But I think engaging with people to try to dispel some of the narratives that may be out there, and engaging with a larger group. I think there is a lot of responses that are driven by either a lack of information or fear. And I think part of our engaging publicly with this is that it sort of dispels some of that fear and hopefully brings more information, more context to what people might be feeling.
Thank you. Victor, another question for you. You indicated that one can vote against a motion to ordain or vote against a call. What if voting against a call or ordination results in the motion to ordain or call a minister fails in a presbytery?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just, I think Dawn had responded to a different question that has some of the same points, which is, as you know, the guidance of the clerks from a couple of years ago, which I alluded to earlier, is that a person, a presbyter, for example, in a presbytery that was dealing with either a call or an ordination, can, without the fear of censure, either abstain from voting or vote against the ordination or induction, or may send regrets to any meeting that deals with the ordination, induction, installation. There was a clerk's report. Part of the clerk's report at last year's assembly attempted to clarify that second point, which was that a person may vote against the ordination, induction, or installation of an individual. And what we wanted to clarify was that you can, and no, everybody has the right to vote. Everybody has the right to a vote. But if you voice your opposition to a call or an ordination based on your opposition to the ability of LGBTQI people, individuals, to be ordained or to be called, then that would not be allowed, because you would be voicing opposition to what the church has already accepted. Now, that was guidance that we had offered in the 2023 assembly, and that report was referred back to the clerks. So we're still in the midst. The clerks are intending to bring back another version of our guidance for consideration at this year's assembly. So in how that sort of relates to the question that was asked is that at this point, if a motion to ordain, or if a motion to call, to sustain a call to an individual was brought before the presbytery, and either through abstaining or through the vote of the majority, who didn't say anything, but just exercised their right to vote, and that vote was no, not in support of either the call or the ordination, we would have to assume that the collective discernment of that presbytery was not to go forward with either the ordination or the call to an individual. I guess the question might arise, and this is the reason why both Don and I are working on, again, further guidance, is if that vote not to ordain or call was based on voiced opinions saying that this is not appropriate, that we should not be ordaining or calling LGBTQI individuals, then I think we would have a problem, because we have said as a church that people who are LGBTQI can be called as ministers and as elders and inducted into those offices as part of the full life of the church. So this is where the issue kind of crops up in terms of, if we say that you cannot base your no vote on that sort of voiced opinion, and if nobody voices an opinion and yet the motion still falls, I don't know that we would have any other alternative than to discern that the presbytery as a whole has discerned that this is not either an appropriate call, or that the ordination should not proceed. Don, I don't know if you want to, yes.
Can I ask a follow-up question then?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in that situation, I hear what you're saying about if there's no voiced opinion that a person, and again, we would need to assume in this situation that a person is openly LGBTQI, like they've expressed that openly in the court, that's open knowledge, and that person is also in a committed relationship with someone of the same sex or same gender. If someone is single, that wouldn't be, like, there would be no valid reasons there, even before. And now if someone is married, that again is not a valid reason in the eyes of the General Assembly. So if a call or an induction is discerned not to go forward by a presbytery, would that individual and or the congregation be able to ask for an appeal? Would that be a measure they could take within the court of the church? And in that process, would there be an opportunity to do some sort of investigation or asking for additional reasons? Like, would that potentially open up conversations that would give that person and congregation some ways forward?
Mhm. Yeah, it's not a question that's been, it's not a situation that we've encountered. First of all, let me say that I would hope and pray that any motion to either sustain a call or to ordain an individual within a presbytery would have been arrived at with much prayer, discernment, and really support. And that hopefully we would never find ourselves in a situation where the presbytery would have moved to the point of a recommendation, a motion to either ordain or to call an individual to a particular ministry without having taken all of those steps very carefully and again with much prayer and discernment that this, that no individual really should be brought before the presbytery without a great deal of confidence around the process, right? I mean, a call that would be brought to the presbytery for a minister, for example, would have had to have gone through, the inner call for that individual, would have had to have gone through the search committee, would have had to have gone through the session, would have had to have gone through the congregation's discernment in terms of meeting with that individual preaching for the call, the vote afterwards, the gathering of signatures in support of that call, and a substantial percentage of signatures that the interim moderator and the presbytery felt that this call could be brought to the presbytery for the presbytery's discernment. So all of those things, and same thing with ordination, is that the ministry committee of a presbytery working with a candidate as a candidate sort of certified for ordination through the colleges, and all of this would have gone through various steps to get to the point where a motion could be made that this individual then be certified for ordination. Again, we would hope and pray that no one ever gets to that point without all of those steps being taken and being supportive. So I think the question would be exceedingly rare, but if it were to ever happen, that after having taken all of these steps, having all of the supportive of actions and documentation with that recommendation before the presbytery, if for some exceedingly rare reason that without voicing it, that a majority of the presbytery said, we're going to vote against either whatever the motion may be, I guess the route towards an appeal would be open, that someone who was part of the presbytery who has the right to appeal can lay a complaint against the decision of the presbytery in this within the proper time frame, and they would be able to execute that appeal to the next highest court. So I suppose that's always possible.
Thank you. I have another question about best practices in presbyteries. The question is, should a presbytery have standing committees or a standing committee that will steward or hold accountable the court to any recommendations that were adopted from the reports of the Rainbow Communion or about the church's work around anti-racism and right relationships with Indigenous peoples? So the question is also, has the General Assembly directed presbyteries to have standing committees that will assist presbyteries, hold presbyteries accountable for fulfilling the recommendations that come from the General Assembly related to the Rainbow Communion or to anti-racism and good relationships with Indigenous people? Maybe we'll start with the clerks, because it is first a question about, did General Assembly direct presbyteries to have such committees? And then maybe talk about what the best practices might be, regardless of what the General Assembly has directed or not. So I wonder whether Don or Victor would answer that.
I'm just reading the question again, Ian. Dawn, you can correct me if I'm incorrect here, but I don't believe that the assembly mandated that presbyteries have these sorts of standing committees that will either steward or hold accountable the courts on the recommendations that have been passed by the assembly, either through the Rainbow Communion or the mandates around anti-racism, relationships with Indigenous peoples, etc. So I don't think we have mandated that presbyteries create such standing committees. It's our expectation and hope, maybe hope more than expectation, maybe I shouldn't have said that. It is our expectation and hope that all presbyteries will uphold and follow through on the decisions that have been arrived at by the General Assembly, and that they will take steps to implement those decisions faithfully and you know, with every good intention. I don't know that we have said that you need a standing committee to ensure this, or that, you know, that you need to somehow report back to the General Assembly whether you've done this or not. I think it's been the right of the presbyteries to follow up on the directives of the General Assembly. It's pretty clear in our governance and polity that lower courts must uphold and implement the decisions of higher courts.
I think perhaps to add to that, yeah, I think while there may not be a requirement, you know, and maybe the framing of accountability may seem harsh to some, I think if it would be supportive within a presbytery's context for a few people to say, look, we've all got a lot to do in the course of our ministry, aside from this work, you know, we need a couple of us to help us keep on track. So thinking about it in terms of what does the presbytery need in terms of support and care might be a more beneficial way to think about that. This work is so contextual. Every congregation will approach these topics a little bit differently, depending on the needs and the people in their congregation. And likewise, presbyteries will also have to make decisions based on who is part of their presbytery and what gifts do they have, what gifts do they need to seek elsewhere. And so I think a standing committee could assist with that work. But I see a limited effectiveness, I would say, to having a committee that's going around saying, thou shalt do this or else. I don't know that that's a way to authentically engage with this work or engage in this work in a sustainable way. That would be my take on this question.
Thank you, Kara. Someone is wondering, again, it's a pastoral question, wondering how the decisions that the church has made are going to affect individual congregations. So will things drastically change now that the recommendations of the General Assembly have been adopted, and now that the church has changed its doctrine and definitions of marriage? To what extent and in what ways will the decisions change congregations and their lived worship life, their lived meeting life? I wonder, Kara, if you were able to start answering that question.
Yeah, and I think, you know, carrying over from my most recent answer, this work is so context dependent that to the extent that it'll impact specific congregations really varies on the people in the congregations themselves and their interests and their desire to implement various steps to review their practices and their policies and procedures. Depends on the wider community that they're situated within, right? So, you know, a small town church may have a very different experience of this than a big city church or a mid-sized city church. Again, in terms of, I think in my last comment, I said something about, you know, sustainable change or sustainable work and authentic work, right? So as a queer trans person myself, like what I want from a congregation, if I'm considering a new church, is to know that they're not acting out of a sense of obligation, but more of a sense of this is how we meet the needs of our community. And this is valuable to us regardless of our sexual orientation and gender identity. So, you know, it's not really a checklist process per se, and we're working on additional resources to help congregations think through these processes. But the answer is, yeah, it could be a lot, it could be a little, it could be not at all. And I hope that mostly these decisions will impact us in positive ways, even in congregations that may never change their understanding of marriage, simply by giving us more context to have conversations about what we believe and how we carry that out as a church, and to figure out how to have those conversations in ways that are gracious and, at best healing, right? That culture of silence I spoke about during the presentation, I think impacts all of us, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, in ways that can be quite intense. But again, for some people are less intense. So hopefully these decisions give us tools and opportunities to be in better relationship with one another.
Thank you.
I just might follow up on that, Ian. I think Kara is absolutely right in that for the context, the answers will vary depending on context. And it will vary depending on the individual. So there will be individuals for whom this issue will be sort of paramount. Either way, either that they are looking for our denomination to have made this decision to be in full support or to be in support, or they have been against the decision, and for them the decision of the denomination to make the decisions we have is something that they cannot abide. So for some individuals, I think that may be a significant, it is a significant issue. I think the one thing we don't want to do is to conflate this issue with lots of other things that are at play with our churches right now, with our congregations right now. And I would hope that people would be very careful not to conflate the other challenges, which are many, that are facing our congregations with the impact of the remits. To say, look where we are, and since the remits were adopted, I think there's many other factors at play. The remits may have that impact again for particular churches and for particular individuals, but for more of a general statement, there are many other factors at play around the current context of our congregations. And I think one just needs to be careful not to necessarily associate the two where there is really no association obvious or necessary.
Thank you. We might have time for just one last question. And Tim, I wonder if you could just give a little bit of advice about how students will be, what kinds of questions are appropriate and what kinds of questions students could expect to be asked as they're interviewed by presbyteries and sessions and guidance conference counselors in regard to the kinds of, the decisions that the church has made about sexuality.
Sure. One of the things that students, well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that guidance conference and also the education and reception process is not exactly a hiring process. It's more like a pre-hiring process. And if a student candidate or a minister, however, is being interviewed by a search committee, by a session or search committee, that is a hiring context. In both instances, though, we need to be careful to realize that we are working within the legal context of having to comply with applicable employment legislation, human rights legislation. So some of the questions that could not be asked would be questions about, you couldn't ask questions about the person's age, you couldn't ask questions about the person's health. You could also not ask questions about the person's marital status or the person's sexual orientation or gender identity. So those would be questions that were out of bounds. Candidates going through interviews for certification by presbytery students committees or attending a guidance conference, they would not be asked which of the two definitions of marriage that they hold. They would be asked questions like, are you aware of and you know about the church's recent decisions on human sexuality? And can you live well and work well within the church that holds these two parallel definitions? They could ask questions as well about the ways that they would work with and would engage others who may have different opinions. Is there anything else we may want to add to that?
I think that's helpful, knowing that the position or the definition that someone holds to is not a feature of an appropriate feature of inquiry, but rather asking how candidates and students feel about the church's decisions and how they can work within them and work with people who have different definitions is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Kara, I think we've come to the end of our time, and I know that people are asking questions about whether they'll receive a copy of this or not, and I want to assure people that they will receive a copy of this after the presentation today.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before we go, I wanted to mention that, there's a variety of resources that we were referencing today or that contain the information that we were speaking about today. So you can find much of this material on presbyterian.ca/sexuality. And if you scroll down to the section links to resources, the ones on your screen are just a few of them. There are many more in that list, and we continue to find ways to make that list more accessible for folks to navigate. But you're able to find more resources there, including that 2022 statement from the clerks, the guidelines re ordination and marriage, and also Rainbow Communion's reports and resources are linked to there as well. So that's kind of your one-stop shop for more information about this. And yeah, we're just so grateful to you all for taking the time to participate today, for watching with us live. And for those of you who are watching the recording, congratulations on making it to the end. For answers to other questions about the church's decisions or how to implement them in your context, you're welcome to reach out to any of us who are presenting today. We've got 3 of our contact information pieces there on the screen. And we're always happy and available to provide information and advice, or to refer you to a member of our team that can better answer your questions. Thank you so much again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Take good care.